Incredible flavours, even better stories. One pour, 10 minutes, Aussie bourbon lovers sharing bourbon with Australia.
Oh, there we go. I always underestimate how long it's going to take me to get the cork out of the top.
It's hard when you got a 5-second timer in front of you. Counting down, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, you got to get the pop right, Dave.
You're kind of revealing behind the scenes a bit there. What are we having, H?
We're having an Old Kempton single malt whiskey. I know, it's not a bourbon.
This is the Old Stables. Cheers.
Cheers.
And if you're playing along at home, this is the December 2021, which is batch 4. The significance of that is that this is probably the batch that was judged the one that won the award, which was Best Australian Small Batch Single Malt in 2022 at the World Whisky Awards. So it's award-winning, but it's not bourbon.
No, and...
Are you okay with the fact that we're drinking a whiskey that's not bourbon, or are you a bit offended by this idea?
No, I think we can't get Australian bourbon for obvious reasons.
Right. Yep.
But whiskey made in Australia,
yeah.
Tassie's the place to go. So I think it's good we're drinking some local quality, not bourbon whiskey.
Not bourbon whiskey. So sharing bourbon with Australia, one pour at a time. This is not bourbon. It does get aged in old bourbon casks. It's one of the things that maybe is the kind of connection between Australian whiskey and bourbon, really, is that we use a lot of whiskey barrels. Well, for lots of stuff, of course. Everyone uses bourbon barrels for lots of stuff, sorry. But the Australian whiskey industry does use the bourbon barrels, often refurbished, which these ones are.
And Old Kempton in particular?
Well, Old Kempton definitely do, yeah. And this one some of this, I don't know exactly what barrels have been used here, but they'll be using some wine. They use port barrels and Pinot barrels, I know that. And they definitely use bourbon barrels. So, yep, that's definitely a thing.
And what are you getting on the nose?
I mean, I'm getting
not
bourbon. It's a single malt made in what I think, and I'm probably going to say this wrong, is the Scotch style. So the grain straight up the front there, is the malted barley, and so that's the single. I hope I'm not getting this wrong. The single malt is the malted barley.
Yeah, it's definitely much more like a...
There's some sweetness to it, but it's got that kind of tanginess that I think...
grainy, I reckon.
Yeah.
It just smells like grain.
Now, we'll get to the reason why we're drinking this in a sec, but this was recommended to me when we were at quite a nice restaurant called Amaru, and they said, would you like a...
You were after a bourbon.
Something to wrap up the meal.
Yeah.
I was like, I'd love a bourbon. And they're like, well, we don't have bourbon, but we've got this whiskey that drinks beautifully. I was like, all right, give me a go. So this is their... And
you were suitably impressed. We now own a bottle.
And this is not our first one either. We've gone through a few of these. And we love our bourbon. So we really mostly enjoy bourbon, but we do have some Tassie whiskies.
We love a trip to Tasmania as well.
We do.
It's our kind of end of January, beginning of February sojourn, at least once a year. And you've actually been to Old Kempton Distillery.
I have been to Old Kempton. So Kempton is about an hour north of Hobart.
Yep.
If you can imagine a map of Australia, if you're not an Australian, Tasmania's a little island at the very bottom underneath Melbourne. About an hour flight from Melbourne to get to Hobart. And then if you drive back up the island of Tasmania, you get to Kempton. And it's just a tiny little town. And Old Kempton Distillery is I think it's the old bank or something like that. It's an old building. Is the kind of the main kind of house. And then there's a distillery that's connected to it. And it has some fun history of its own, but Tasmanian distilling is interesting when you think about the history of bourbon and the history of whiskies around the world. You think about how long it's been going for, but Bill Lark, who's the kind of the grandfather of Australian whiskey, really only kind of finally got the government to say you're allowed to distill anything in Australia, distill a spirit in Australia in the early 90s. So
that's like the earliest distilling whiskey.
The Australian whiskey industry or spirits industry.
Bourbon that I do about whiskey in Australia.
Is only about 30 years old.
Yeah.
And so even our oldest stuff isn't that old if it's real Australian whiskey really made in Tassie. And so the bulk of our distilleries are in Tasmania, which is kind of close.
Would you say Old Kempton is one of the more well-known Tassie distilleries, or...?
Probably, I think, in the top... Say 10. I'm making this up, but that's probably about right. Lark is the one that everyone knows, and it's quite big. There was another distillery called Nant that doesn't exist anymore, and that's quite famously is involved in what's now a court case about.
I love good stories behind the whiskey that we drink.
Well, maybe we could do that another time. But the guy's accused of having kind of swindled a lot of people out of money through a barrel investing scheme. And then there's others like Overeem and Spring Bay and newer ones like Warps Harbour and stuff like that as well. Belgrove is a quite famous one because the character who runs that. But there's lots of distilleries down there and good fun and great to visit. And you come to Australia if you want to check out.
And were you happy when you got poured this instead of a bourbon? Did it kind of?
Was I happy?
I think I was impressed. It impressed you because you weren't prepared to be impressed because they didn't have bourbon.
I mean, was I impressed? I don't know if I was impressed. I was happy. Yeah. It's super easy drinking. It's only 40% or 40.5%. So it goes down pretty smoothly. Yep. There is some lovely sweetness that comes from the barrels. Of course, they're using second fill barrels. So you get some sweetness from the bourbon barrels they use and then the wine barrels too. So, yeah, I mean, it's lovely. I think every time I have these whiskies that aren't bourbon, that don't have the sweetness and the corn influence.
Yeah, missing the corn.
I remember why I love bourbon so much. That's really what my answer is.
But for those who are after a very delicious tasting whiskey that's readily available in Australia, an Old Kempton is a great one to grab.
One of the really interesting things that happens because the whiskey industry is so young in Australia and because we've got these huge taxes, these crazy taxes, is it's really expensive. This is a 500ml bottle. Sorry, get out and support the Aussie distillers. This is a 500ml bottle. Definitely. I think it's about $200. Yeah,
compared to what you could buy a bottle of bourbon in the US for that.
A $200 bourbon in Australian dollars is still quite a good bourbon.
Yeah. It's like a very nice drop of bourbon. But this is like,
Yeah, but get amongst the support. And they do some tiny batches, small batches, by comparison to American distilleries and by bourbon runs. And the other one that's interesting is we talked about, we were, the reason we're having it tonight is we were in Tassie on the weekend.
Yeah.
And we were talking about going to do a distillery tour. And the distillery tours over there are so tiny, everything's so small. It's done in these tiny little...
very boutique little...
pot stills and small batches and all that kind of stuff. So it's definitely not the same level that you get when you have a bit of fun on the Kentucky Bourbon Trail.
No, but it's still delicious.
And
Tassie's a fabulous place to go visit.
Why is it a fabulous place to visit?
I don't know. It's not very far away from where we are, and they make delicious whiskies.
Yes.
And it gives you that kind of old school feel. Like I feel like I'm in, I don't know, Scotland or England, or just the weather and the old buildings and it's a good vibe. Yeah. I love Tassie. I feel relaxed when I'm in Tasmania.
Do you know what's a really good thing to do in Tassie?
What?
Drink bourbon.
Yes, we do. We drink the local whiskies and we take a bottle of bourbon with us.
I did go to the Tassie Whiskey Festival.
Yeah.
Tassie Whiskey Show? Tassie Whiskey Festival, I think it was. Tas Whiskey Week, I think it's called.
Yeah.
This year just gone. Yeah, last August. And it was good fun.
Yeah. Lots of great stories came back from that. I didn't get to go.
Australian whiskey, really. But, yeah, like good fun. And the thing that I love about it is I love supporting these little distillers who are doing great stuff and just plugging away, doing amazing stuff. And the whiskey is beautiful for single malts and does compete with the world's best Sullivans Cove won world's best whiskey only a few years ago, which is another one of the well-known Australian distilleries. Yeah. And that's, Sullivans Cove is basically where we stay.
Yeah, and I think Tassie also has that little thing about it that I found really big in Kentucky with, they each lift each other up like that. What is it? Rising tide lifts all boats. Yeah. They're really supportive of each other and love helping each other out. And that same vibe is very much in Kentucky with all the bourbon distilleries and everything. They all really support each other and are able to tell each other great things and recommend other ones to go to. And I feel like Tassie definitely has that vibe as well.
Yep, absolutely. So if you do get to Australia, obviously outside of Tassie, kind of up on the mainland, there's lots of good ones too. Starwood and Archie Rose and Gospel, and there's a good list of ones who are on the mainland as well. So check out Aussie distilleries as well, because they make great stuff too.
Yeah.
It's not bourbon. It can't be called bourbon if it's not made in America. So
I know.
and they often aren't trying to do that 51% corn mash bill, but
We do
definitely
love the corn, but
like to
we
support
do. Yeah, we love supporting Aussie whiskies.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you're connected with us on TikTok, Instagram and YouTube, and stay connected with us by clicking subscribe on your favourite podcast app.